The ring hit the floorboards of Mabel Merriweather's general store with a sound like a gunshot, and every soul in Dustcreek, Texas, went silent. Harvey Mercer stood on the other side of the counter, his hat in one hand, the small gold band rolling in a slow, mocking circle near the barrel of dried beans. His jaw was tight. His gray eyes, usually calm as still water, burned with something Mabel had never seen in them before, not anger, not wounded pride, but something rawer, something closer to desperation. "Pick it up," she said, her voice low and even, the way she spoke when she was fighting hard to keep herself steady. "I didn't throw it," he said. "It slipped." "Everything always slips with you, Harvey Mercer. Your words, your intentions, your promises." She set both palms flat on the counter and met his gaze. "And now apparently your ring." The three men at the far end of the store pretended to study the sacks of flour with enormous concentration. Old Tommy Ruiz, who swept the steps every morning and had seen everything Dustcreek had ever produced, did not even pretend. He leaned on his broom and watched with the frank, unapologetic interest of a man who understood he was witnessing something worth watching. "Mabel," Harvey's voice cracked on her name. "No," she said simply. "You haven't heard what I don't need to hear it." "This is the fourth time, Harvey, the fourth." She straightened, folding her arms across the front of her apron. "I have given you 4 polite refusals. I have been patient, I have been kind. I have not embarrassed you, and I have not made a production of it, and I have asked nothing in return for that courtesy except that you stop." She looked down at the ring on the floor. "Pick it up, take it home, and let this be finished." Harvey bent down slowly and retrieved the ring. He turned it between his fingers for a moment, looking at it with an expression that Mabel could not quite categorize. Then he looked up at her, and what he said next was the last thing she expected from a man who had never once, in 4 proposals, ever told her the truth about why he was asking. "I know about the debt," he said quietly. "All of it, every cent." The store went very still. Mabel's hands pressed harder into the counter. "I know about the bank note on this building," he continued, his voice just above a whisper. "I know about your father's arrangement with Cornelius Fitch before he died. I know what Fitch is planning to do with the deed at the end of this month. And I know you've been sitting on all of it alone for 7 months without telling a single living person." The men near the flour sacks were no longer pretending to look at anything other than what was happening in front of them. Mabel's expression did not change. That was her gift and her armor and the thing that had kept her upright through the worst year of her life, the ability to hold her face like stone while everything inside her was falling. "Get out of my store, Harvey," she said. He picked up his hat. He put it on. He walked to the door, and he stopped with his hand on the frame, and he said, without turning around, "I'm not asking you to marry me this time, Mabel. I'm just asking you to let me help." Then he was gone, and the bell above the door rang twice in the silence. Mabel stood very still for a long moment. Then she reached under the counter, found the small tin box she kept there, and opened it. Inside was a folded piece of paper she had read so many times the creases were starting to pull apart. A bank note, her father's signature at the bottom, and at the top in neat, formal lettering the name of the man who now held it, Cornelius Fitch. The amount was $940. She had 47. That was where the story truly began. Not with the ring falling, not with Harvey's knowing gaze, not even with the word no that she had said 4 times, and had meant every single time for reasons she had never shared with anyone. It began 18 months earlier, in the spring of 1882, when her father, Gerald Merriweather, had made a terrible mistake, and a good man had ridden into Dustcreek with dust on his coat and secrets of his own. Dustcreek sat in the flat, sun-hammered country of West Texas, the kind of place that felt like the edge of everything. The town had been built around a trading post and a single reliable spring, and by 1882 it had grown to a proper settlement. 230 souls, a main street with a saloon, a livery, a barber shop, Mabel's general store, and a small wooden church at the northern end of the street that the Reverend Aldous Hicks treated as his personal kingdom. The land around Dustcreek was hard and beautiful in the particular way that difficult things can be beautiful. The sky was enormous. The grasses went brown and gold in the heat. The hills to the west looked like sleeping animals at dusk, and at night the stars came out in their millions, cold and indifferent and spectacular. Gerald Merriweather had run the general store for 22 years. He was a decent man, honest on the whole, good with numbers, known for extending credit to families who needed it without making them feel ashamed. He had raised Mabel alone after her mother, Clara, died of fever when Mabel was 9 years old. He had done his best. His best had been, by most measures, quite good. But in the summer of 1881, Gerald had done something that was not good at all. Cornelius Fitch had arrived in Dustcreek the previous spring, 1880, with money and ambition, and the particular kind of smile that makes a person feel both flattered and uneasy. He bought the land east of town, built a proper house with a veranda, wore suits that had been made somewhere with more tailors than Texas, and positioned himself as a businessman of substance. He spoke of railroads and expansion and the future, and he had a way of presenting an opportunity that made the person he was presenting it to feel as though they were being invited into something exclusive and fortunate. Gerald Merriweather had been one of those people. In July of 1881, persuaded that Fitch's proposed land consortium would triple his investment within a year, Gerald had borrowed $940 against the deed of the store and put it into Fitch's scheme. The consortium, as it happened, existed primarily on paper. By October, Gerald knew he had been swindled. By November, he was sick with the knowledge and the effort of hiding it from Mabel. By January of 1882, he was dead pneumonia, the doctor said, though Mabel understood that a man could go to his grave from grief and shame just as surely as from any disease. He had told her everything 3 days before he died. He had shown her the note. He had held her hand and wept and said he was sorry, and she had told him it was all right, that she would handle it, that he should rest. She had meant it. She was 26 years old, capable, clear-eyed, and deeply, privately terrified. She had handled it for 7 months by running the store well, keeping meticulous accounts, and not telling anyone. She had made $30, sometimes $40 a month, which was good for a store of that size, but it was nowhere near enough to service a debt of $940 with the interest that Cornelius Fitch was quietly adding each month. Fitch himself had come to see her twice. He was a large man in his mid-40s, broad-shouldered, with graying sideburns and a manner that was impeccably polite and entirely cold. He expressed condolences about her father. He expressed confidence that she would find a solution. He noted with great gentleness the date on which the note came due, the end of October. 6 weeks away, when Harvey Mercer walked into her store and let that ring fall and said the words that changed everything. Harvey Mercer had come to Dustcreek 8 months earlier, in February of 1882, which was almost immediately after Gerald's death, though she had not yet understood the significance of that timing. He had appeared at first simply as a man who needed supplies and a place to board. He had taken a room above the saloon, paid promptly, caused no trouble, and within 2 weeks had bought a small piece of land 2 miles south of town. He was 32 years old. He was lean and weathered in the way that men who work outdoors go lean, and weathered, not starved-looking but precise, as though the landscape had worn away everything unnecessary. His hair was dark and his eyes were gray, and he had a scar along the left side of his jaw that he never explained. He spoke in a measured way that Mabel found appealing despite herself, with the careful diction of someone who had taught himself to speak well and took quiet satisfaction in doing it right. He had first come into the store for flour and salt and a length of rope. He had come back 3 days later for nails and window glass. He had come back after that for coffee and beans and a wool blanket, and on that third visit he had stayed long enough to talk, and Mabel had been surprised to find that talking to him was easy. He listened. He asked questions that showed he had actually heard what she said. He did not take up more than his share of a conversation, which was rarer than it should have been. By March, she looked forward to his visits. By April, she found herself noting when she had not seen him for a few days. By May, she was aware, with the precise awareness of a woman who has long since learned to be careful with herself, that she was in danger of something she had not invited. The first time he asked her to accompany him to the church social, she had said no pleasantly, citing the demands of the store on a Saturday evening. This was true enough, but it was not the whole truth. The whole truth was that she did not trust the speed at which she was beginning to trust him. He had nodded agreeably, bought a tin of peaches, and left without any visible wound to his pride. She had appreciated that. The first real proposal came 6 weeks after that, in June, on an ordinary Tuesday morning. He came in for coffee. They talked about the weather and the new family that had arrived from Kansas and taken the Jensen property, and then he said, calmly and without apparent preamble, "Mabel, I would like to ask you to marry me." She had set down the tin scoop. She had looked at him. She had said, "I am not going to do that, Harvey, but I do thank you for asking." He had said, "May I ask why not?" She had said, "Because I don't know you well enough, and I make it a policy not to do things I don't know well enough." He had thought about that for a moment and said, "That seems fair," and had left with his coffee. This was what made Harvey Mercer confusing. He accepted her refusals with a grace that felt genuine rather than strategic, which meant she could not fault him for it, which meant she kept letting him come back to the store, which meant she kept talking to him, which meant she kept learning things about him that she found compelling and unsettling in equal measure. He had grown up in Missouri, the son of a blacksmith. He had come west at 19, worked cattle drives for 7 years, and then gradually shifted into land and small-scale ranching. He actually read, not just the almanac but novels and newspapers, and anything he could get his hands on. He had strong opinions about water rights and irrigation and the future of the Texas Panhandle. He was funny in a dry, understated way that revealed itself slowly, so that you were often laughing before you understood you had been made to. And he was kind. Not performatively kind, not the kind of kind that was actually just maneuvering in a more socially acceptable direction, but genuinely, practically, quietly kind. He had helped the widow Esther Crane move a stuck wagon wheel without being asked or making mention of it afterward. He had found old Tommy Ruiz's missing dog 3 miles east of town and brought it back wrapped in his own jacket because it was January and the dog was old and cold. He had sat with the dying horse of a 10-year-old boy named Cal Patton and helped the boy understand what was happening without lying to him or minimizing it. Mabel had seen all of these things. She had filed them carefully, evidence for and against, and had arrived at a verdict she could not quite articulate even to herself. Harvey Mercer was a good man. She was not entirely sure why, given that he was a good man, she kept saying no. The second proposal had come in August, more formal this time. He had come to the store on a Sunday evening when it was quiet, wearing a clean shirt, and asked if she might consider becoming his wife. He had said he believed they were well suited. He had said he had deep respect for her. He had said he would endeavor, if she said yes, to be worthy of the trust she placed in him. She had listened to all of it. She had said, "Harvey, I believe you mean everything you are saying, and I do not think you are a bad person. But respect and compatibility are not enough reasons to marry someone, and I am not going to marry a person for anything less than the right reasons." He had said, "What are the right reasons in your view?" She had said, "When I know, I will tell you." He had gone quiet for a moment, nodded, and left. It was after this second refusal that Mabel began to wonder about herself with a more direct and uncomfortable intensity. She was 26 years old, soon to be 27. She was not a woman who made decisions from fear or convention. She had turned down 2 other men in the past 3 years, James Halliday, who was perfectly agreeable but whose treatment of his horses told her things about his character that no amount of Sunday manners could undo, and Pierce Donnelly, who wanted a housekeeper more than a wife, and was not aware enough of the distinction to be embarrassed about it. With Harvey, she could point to none of those flaws. She looked for them with real diligence and found only small ones, human ones, the kind that told her he was real rather than the kind that told her to run. What she found instead, when she searched herself honestly, was this: she was afraid. Not of Harvey specifically, but of the particular vulnerability of loving someone when the ground beneath you was already shaking. She knew about the debt. She knew the store might not survive the autumn. She knew that if she let herself fall in love with Harvey Mercer and then lost everything, she would have lost two things at once, and she did not know if she was strong enough for that. So she had built a wall, a polite one, a reasonable-sounding one, but a wall nonetheless. The third proposal came in September, and by this time it had become a topic of conversation in Dustcreek, because small towns do not have the patience for private matters. People discussed it at the saloon and over fences and in lowered voices after Sunday services. Some of them thought Mabel was foolish. Some thought she was sensible. Old Tommy Ruiz, when asked, said only that he had lived long enough to know that people generally get there eventually, and that rushing them was like pulling on a plant to make it grow faster, which only damaged the roots. The third proposal had an edge to it that the first two had not. Not cruelty. Harvey was incapable of cruelty with her, she was fairly sure, but a kind of barely controlled frustration that told her the grace with which he accepted her refusals was not as effortless as it appeared. He had said, in a voice that was carefully level, "I want you to know that I am asking for honest reasons, Mabel. I am not asking because I am lonely, though I am. I am not asking because it would be convenient, though it would be. I am asking because when I think about spending the rest of my life in this town, the thing that makes it worth thinking about is you." He had paused. "I want you to know that before you tell me no again." She had stood very still for a moment, and something in her had pulled hard toward him, like a compass needle toward north, involuntary and unarguable. She had wanted to say yes. She had looked at his face and wanted to say yes with a clarity that was almost painful. She had said, "I'm sorry, Harvey." He had closed his eyes for a single breath, opened them, and said, "All right." Then he had walked out of the store, and for the first time she had watched him go with something that felt like genuine grief. That night she had sat up until well past midnight, going over the accounts for the sixth time that week, as though the numbers might have changed while she wasn't looking. They had not changed. She had $41 in the tin box and a debt she could not pay, and 6 weeks until Cornelius Fitch came to collect it. She had not slept well since February. In the days following the third refusal, something shifted in the dynamic between them, subtle but real. He still came to the store because he still needed supplies and she was the store, but the conversations were shorter. He was still kind, still courteous, but there was a guardedness now where the openness had been, and Mabel missed the openness with a precision that told her things she was still not ready to acknowledge fully. It was during this period, those quiet, tightening weeks of October, that she began to notice things about Harvey that she had not noticed before, or rather, that she had noticed but not yet assembled into meaning. He had conversations with people in town that she was not party to but could not help partially overhearing. He had a long discussion with Jacob Haynes at the bank one Thursday morning. He rode out to see Nathan Reed, who was the county land agent, on a Friday. He spent an afternoon in the barber shop, which in Dustcreek was where men went to exchange information under the guise of getting haircuts, and when he came out, old Rufus Crane, who ran the barber shop, had watched him walk down the street with an expression Mabel could not interpret from her window. She had filed this too, without understanding what it meant. And then there was the fourth proposal, the one that ended with the ring on the floor and the words that had changed everything. After Harvey left that afternoon, after he said, "I'm not asking you to marry me this time, I'm just asking you to let me help," Mabel closed the store an hour early. This was something she had never done in 7 months of running it alone. She sent old Tommy Ruiz home. She locked the door. She went into the back room, sat down on the crate she used as a stool when she was doing accounts, and let herself shake for about 3 minutes. Then she stopped shaking and thought very carefully about what Harvey knowing about the debt actually meant. He knew. He had known for some time, apparently, because the way he said it was not the way a person says something they have just discovered. It was the way a person says something they have been waiting for the right moment to say. How he knew was a question. The banknote was between her father and Cornelius Fitch. It was not public record, exactly, though in a town the size of Dustcreek, private and public were not always clearly distinct territories. Jacob Haynes at the bank would have known. One or two others might have known, might have spoken. The barber shop. Nathan Reed. The pieces she had been filing without understanding began to rearrange themselves. Harvey Mercer had been asking questions about Cornelius Fitch. That was what those conversations had been. He had been gathering information, carefully, quietly, the way a man does when he is building a case rather than spreading gossip. But why? He had proposed to her 4 times before he revealed this knowledge, which meant the proposals were not contingent on it, not offers of financial rescue dressed up as romance. He had not once, in any of those 4 proposals, mentioned the debt or the store or anything that suggested his motivation was anything other than what he had said it was. He had said he wanted her. He had said she was the thing that made the future worth thinking about. The debt was separate. He had kept it separate. That distinction mattered. It mattered enormously, in a way that Mabel sat with for a long time in the small, quiet back room of the store she stood to lose. She slept poorly that night again, but for different reasons than usual. The next morning she was up before dawn, as she always was, and she had the store open and the front steps swept by the time the sun was fully risen. Harvey did not come that day. He did not come the following day either. On the 3rd day, she sent old Tommy Ruiz to find him. Harvey came that afternoon in the middle of the day, while the store had its usual slow-hour quiet. He came in and stood at the counter the way he always stood, hat in his hands, and waited. "Sit down," she said. She gestured to the 2 chairs she kept near the stove for conversations that were going to take longer than a counter exchange. He sat. She came out from behind the counter and sat across from him, and she put the tin box on the small table between them. "Open it," she said. He opened it. He read the note without expression, taking his time, reading it thoroughly the way a careful man reads something important. Then he folded it back along its worn creases and put it in the box and closed the lid. $940, he said. Plus 5 months of interest at Fitch's rate, which he has been applying informally and which he will argue is binding. I estimate he will present a figure of somewhere between $1,100 and $1,200 when he comes at the end of the month. Mabel had not known about the informal interest. The number hit her like cold water. "How do you know about the interest?" "Because I have been looking into Cornelius Fitch," Harvey said, "for 4 months. "Why?" she asked. He met her eyes. "Because I did not like the way he spoke to you the second time he came to see you here." "You saw that?" "I was across the street. I could see through the window." He paused. "He was polite. He has very good manners. But I watched him look at you the way a man looks at something he already considers his, and I did not like it." Mabel was quiet for a moment. "You've been investigating him for 4 months. "I have been making inquiries," Harvey said carefully. "And what did your inquiries find?" He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and produced a folded sheaf of papers. He set them on the table between them without fuss. "The land consortium he offered your father was not the first scheme of its kind. He ran a similar arrangement in New Mexico Territory in 1879, under a different company name, and left 3 families in financial ruin. There are 2 men in this county, outside of Dustcreek, who lost property to him in the last 2 years through debt instruments. He has a pattern, Mabel. He finds people with assets and finds their moment of vulnerability, and he moves in." Mabel looked at the papers. Her hands did not tremble, but they wanted to. "Can any of this be used?" "I have sent letters to a circuit judge in San Antonio," Harvey said. "A man named Harlan Greer who has been looking for grounds to bring a fraud case against Fitch for 18 months. What I have found gives him new material to work with." He paused. It is not fast enough to stop what happens at the end of this month. Judge Greer cannot move before then, but there is something else. What? Fitch holds your note, but what he wants ultimately is not money. He wants the building. He wants the location. He wants to own the main commercial artery of this town because he believes the railroad spur that is being planned for this part of the county will run through Dustcreek within 5 years, and he wants to be positioned for it. Mabel had known about the railroad speculation in a vague way. She had not thought about it in the context of Fitch's interest in her property. The note gives him the right to claim the building if the debt is unpaid, she said slowly. Yes, Harvey said. But only if there is no competing offer. If someone else were to purchase the note from Fitch before the due date, pay him the full amount outstanding, then Fitch has no further claim. Who would purchase a bank note for $1,200? Mabel said, but even as she said it, she heard how it sounded and she went still. Harvey looked at her steadily and said nothing. Harvey, her voice was very quiet. What have you done? Nothing yet, he said. I wanted to talk to you first. You have $1,200. He had the land south of town, which he had bought for a reasonable price and which was worth, she knew, considerably more than he had paid. He had been in Texas long enough, careful enough with money, working enough years, that it was not impossible. It was not the question of whether he had it. I want to be clear about what I am offering, he said carefully. I am not offering to buy your debt so that you owe me instead. I am offering to purchase the note from Fitch on the condition that it is then forgiven, permanently, in writing, notarized, your store, your building, free and clear. Mabel stared at him. You would forgive $1,200? Yes. Why? His jaw tightened just slightly. Because I care more about you having what is yours than I care about $1,200. The silence in the store was very deep. Outside, a horse went past, and 2 women were talking somewhere up the street, and the wind moved through the eaves with its usual dry whisper. I refused you 4 times, she said. I know. You are offering this regardless. Yes, that is, she stopped. She started again. That is either the most generous thing I have ever heard or the most frightening, and I cannot tell which. Why would it be frightening, he asked, and the question was genuine, not defensive. Because if you do this, I will owe you something that cannot be repaid in money, and I don't know what you would want in return. She held his gaze. I know you say nothing. But Harvey, nobody does something like this for nothing. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, You are right that I want something. I am not going to lie to you about that. He leaned forward slightly. I want you to give me a fair chance. Not a proposal, not a wedding, not anything you are not ready for. Just stop assuming you already know the answer. Let me court you properly the way I should have from the beginning without proposals that you feel cornered by. Let me simply be a man you know, and let that be enough for now, and let whatever comes from it come honestly. Mabel looked at him for a long, long moment. You are asking me to be open. Yes. Not to marry you. Not today, he said, just to stop being closed. She thought about the wall she had built and the reason she had built it and whether the reason was still good enough. She thought about the last 7 months and the tin box and the nights she had not slept. She thought about the way he had watched through the window when Fitch came, the quiet, focused attention of a man who had already decided to do something about what he was seeing. All right, she said finally. I accept. The financial matter, yes, and the other thing too. Something moved across Harvey's face, relief, she thought, but also something more complicated, something that looked close to the edge of feeling and then drew back to its usual composed self. He nodded. I will go to Fitch tomorrow, he said. Nathan Reed will draw up the paperwork. It will be done before the week is out. She reached across the table and picked up the tin box and put it back under the counter. She stood for a moment with her back to him and let herself breathe properly for the first time in months. Then she turned around. Harvey, she said, why did you wait? If you knew all this months ago, why wait until the 4th proposal to tell me? He was quiet for a moment. Because I did not want you to say yes to the proposal because of the financial situation. I did not want to be the man who bought himself a wife. He turned his hat in his hands. I wanted the answer to be about me. Not my money, not my usefulness, me. He paused. I was not trying to hide it from you. I was trying to get the order right. Mabel considered this. That, she said slowly, is the most thoughtful thing anyone has ever done with a secret. He almost smiled. It was a small thing, just a shift at the corner of his mouth, but she had learned to read his face well enough to know that small shifts meant large things in Harvey Mercer's language. I'll see you tomorrow, he said. I'll be here, she said. Harvey walked out of the store, and Mabel stood in the quiet and realized that the tight, compressed fear that had lived in her chest since February had loosened, just slightly, for the first time. It was not gone. There was still Fitch and the paperwork and 100 things that could still go wrong. But something had shifted, the way a door shifts when you find the right key, not open yet, but no longer locked. The next morning, Harvey rode out to Cornelius Fitch's property. He told her about it later, matter-of-factly, the way he told stories without drama, in the right order, without embellishment, but without omission either. Fitch had received him in the front parlor of his house, which was expensively furnished in a way that looked borrowed from somewhere more sophisticated. Harvey had stated his purpose plainly. He wished to purchase the Merriweather note for its full outstanding value, including all interest Fitch claimed was owed, to be paid immediately in currency, on the condition that the note was marked satisfied and forgiven, and that Fitch signed a document releasing all claims to the Merriweather property in perpetuity. Fitch had been very still for a long moment. Then he had smiled, the particular smile of a man recalculating. He had asked what Harvey's interest in the matter was. Harvey had said he was a business associate of the Merriweather family. Fitch had said he was not sure the note was for sale. Harvey had set the sheaf of papers on the table between them, the same papers he had showed Mabel. He had said, calmly and without heat, I have a correspondence underway with Judge Harlan Greer in San Antonio. These documents relate to a pattern of fraud in New Mexico Territory in 1879 and 2 subsequent incidents in this county. They represent, in my legal view, grounds for a civil suit and potentially a criminal one. My offer is $1,180 for the note and all associated claims. If you decline, I will complete my correspondence with Judge Greer, and you will have neither the money nor the property. There had been a very long silence. Fitch had said, with his impeccable politeness still intact but his eyes cold as November, You have done your research, Mr. Mercer, Harvey had said. I have been thorough. Fitch had taken the money. He had signed the documents. He had left Dustcreek 3 weeks later, and he had not come back. Nathan Reed notarized the forgiveness of the note and filed the deed in Mabel's name alone on the 24th of October, 1882. Mabel had stood in the land office and held the filed deed in her hands and breathed. Reed had the good sense not to say anything, and had simply offered her a cup of poor coffee, which she had accepted gratefully. She had gone back to the store and turned the sign to open and sold 3 pounds of nails to a farmer from the south end of the valley, and a bolt of blue calico to Esther Crane, and a bag of coffee to old Tommy Ruiz, who did not need coffee but wanted to come in and look at her in a satisfied way that communicated his awareness of what had happened and his approval of it. You look like yourself again, Tommy said. I feel like myself again, she said. Harvey came in at 4 o'clock, the usual mid-afternoon lull, and bought a bag of cornmeal and a tin of molasses, both of which she suspected he did not actually need. The deed is filed, she said. I know, Reed told me. Thank you, she said, and she meant it with every part of herself, and she made sure he could hear that she meant it. He said, You're welcome, and there was nothing complicated in it, just simple and clean and real. Then he said, with the careful air of a man testing new ground, There is a harvest social at the Andersons' place on Saturday. Several families, nothing formal. I wondered if you might want to come. She studied him. Are you courting me, Harvey Mercer? I am attempting to, he said, with your permission. She had told him to let whatever came from it come honestly. She had told him to simply be a man she knew and let that be enough. She had been working toward honesty herself for months, and she was going to be honest now. Yes, she said, I'll come. The harvest social at the Anderson farm was exactly what it sounded like: half a dozen farm families. A fiddle player named Ben Castillo, who had 3 songs he played in different orders to make it seem like more. A bonfire, and a great deal of food that people had spent the week preparing with the combined competitive and generous spirit that characterizes community cooking in isolated places. Mabel arrived with Harvey and was immediately absorbed by 3 women who needed to discuss the calico situation at the store. The new preacher's wife who had arrived and turned out to be both younger and more interesting than anyone had expected, and the best recipe for persimmon pudding. Harvey was absorbed by a cluster of men discussing water rights and cattle prices, which he was clearly better at discussing than she had given him credit for, watching him from across the firelight. She noticed that he watched her too, periodically, not in a surveillance way but in the way of a person checking on something valuable. Not possessive, attentive. There was a difference. They found each other again when Ben Castillo switched to something slower and couples began to drift together at the edge of the firelight. Harvey came over with 2 cups of cider and offered her one without making an event of it, and they stood together for a while watching the dancers. "You grew up here," he said. It was not quite a question. "My whole life," she said. "I have never been more than 40 miles from where we're standing." "Does that bother you?" She considered it honestly. "Sometimes I wonder about it, but this is my place, this store, this land. My father's hands built those shelves." She paused. "Do you mind that I'm rooted here?" "No," he said. "I have been looking for a place to put down roots for 13 years. The fact that yours are already here seems like efficiency rather than a problem." She laughed genuinely, a full laugh, not the polite laugh she deployed in social situations. It surprised her a little, the way real laughter does when you have not been doing much of it. Harvey turned to look at her when she laughed, and there was something in his expression that was so unguarded and warm that she felt it like sunlight on the skin. "What?" She said. "Nothing," he said. "You just laugh differently than you smile." "What does that mean?" "Your smile is composed," he said. "Considered, it is a kind smile. But when you laugh, you forget to be careful about it." He took a sip of his cider. "I like when you forget to be careful." Mabel looked at the fire for a moment and did not say what came to her first, which was that she had been careful for so long that she had almost forgotten the feel of not being careful. She said instead, "Dance with me." He looked at her with a brief, unguarded surprise, and then he set down both cups and offered his hand, and they joined the other couples in the uneven firelit space near the fiddle player who was by now on his 4th round of the same 3 songs. Harvey danced adequately. He was not graceful, but he was steady and he did not step on her feet, and he held her at the right distance, close enough to be dancing, not so close as to be presumptuous. She found herself liking the solidity of his hand and the warmth of him, and the fact that he did not talk during the dancing, just paid attention to the music and to her, and that was more than sufficient. When the song ended, they stepped apart, and the distance between them felt suddenly different from all the distances that had come before, as though something that had been held in tension had simply and quietly relaxed. He walked her home that night. The stars were very bright over Dustcreek, as they always were, indifferent and spectacular. They walked slowly because neither of them was in a hurry. When they reached the door of her rooms above the store, she stood on the step and he stood in the street below, and this put them at roughly the same height, which felt right. "Thank you," she said, "for all of it." "I haven't done anything worth thanking yet," he said. "You have done considerable things worth thanking," she said. "The courting is just beginning," he said. "Reserve your judgment." "Harvey," she tilted her head slightly. "Why did you stay in Dustcreek? You could have gone anywhere. Men with your experience and means had options. Why here?" He was quiet for a moment. "I came here because I had information about a land scheme that had cost a good man considerably, and I thought I might be able to do something about it. I had run into a similar scheme 2 years before in another town and had not moved fast enough, and a family there had lost their home." He paused. "When your father died and you were left alone with the consequence of what Fitch had done to him, I stayed because I could see what was coming, and I did not want to be the man who left before finishing what he came to do. She was very still. You came here specifically because of Fitch. I came because of Fitch, he said. I stayed because of you. This was, she thought, the truest thing anyone had ever said to her, and it was also the most complicated, and she needed to sit with it. Good night, Harvey, she said. Good night, Mabel, he said. She went inside and stood in the dark for a while with her hand on the wall and thought about dark pasts and hidden purposes and the difference between a trap and a rescue, and whether Harvey Mercer was entirely what he said he was. Then she thought about the way he had danced with her, steady and unshowy and present, and the way he had watched her from across the fire with the look of a man who was keeping track of something he valued. She thought about the 4 proposals and the fact that not one of them had been about the debt. He had, she decided, very possibly loved her before he liked her, and had taken considerable trouble to learn how to like her as well. She went to bed and slept better than she had in a year. November in West Texas brings a sharp, clean cold after the long heat, and the town settles into itself in a different way, more interior, more deliberate. Mabel kept the store busy through the early winter preparations, stocking wool and lamp oil and preserved goods, and the small luxuries that people allowed themselves before the lean months. Harvey came in regularly, as he always had, but now there was a new quality to the regularity, an acknowledged one, seen and understood by both of them and by the town, which had opinions about it that it expressed with varying degrees of subtlety. Reverend Aldous Hicks expressed his opinion on the subject of Harvey Mercer and Mabel Merriweather directly and without subtlety, because subtlety was not among his gifts. He came into the store one Tuesday and said that it was his pastoral responsibility to mention that the town had noticed the nature of the friendship between Mabel and Harvey, and that he hoped matters would proceed in a manner appropriate to the community's standards and the church's expectations. Mabel sold him a £1/4 of tobacco and said she was grateful for his concern. Esther Crane expressed her opinion by bringing Mabel a jar of apple butter and saying, in the way of a woman who has been happily married for 30 years and wants the same for others, "He is a good one, Mabel." The good ones are not always apparent at first, but they are apparent eventually, and the eventually is worth the patience. Tommy Ruiz expressed his opinion by saying nothing at all, but sweeping the steps with a particular satisfaction that communicated everything. The courting proceeded with a care and seriousness that matched the people involved. Harvey took Mabel riding on Sunday afternoons, when the store was closed, and she showed him the parts of the county that she had lived in her whole life and knew in the particular, intimate way of long familiarity. The creek that ran good in spring, the arroyo where her father had once found an ancient Spanish coin, the hill that caught the sunset light in a way that turned the land briefly golden and improbable. He listened to these places the way he listened to her, attentive and without rushing, as though the details were important, which to her they were. She learned more about him in this quieter way. His dark past was not dramatic in the specific sense, but it had weight. A younger brother lost to a fever at 14 that Harvey had not been present for, having already left Missouri by then, and the guilt of that absence that had never fully resolved itself. A love before Mabel, a woman in Kansas, name of Josephine, who had married someone else while Harvey was on a cattle drive and had not thought to tell him until he returned, which had taught him a sharp lesson about the dangers of assumption. He told her these things plainly, without self-pity, and she received them in the same spirit in which they were offered. She told him things too. She told him about her mother's death and the particular solitude of growing up in a store, surrounded by people's needs, but surrounded by your own aloneness too. She told him about the year she had spent being angry at her father after she learned the truth about the debt, working through it, and then the grief of his dying before she could fully arrive at the forgiveness she knew was the right destination. She told him about the long habit of self-sufficiency she had built in that solitude, and how it was a good habit in many ways and a terrible one in others. The terrible way being, he said, the keeping things to myself, she said, the assumption that I have to manage everything alone. The terror of being a burden, she paused. My father was afraid to be a burden to me. He hid the debt because of it. He went to his grave afraid that he had failed me, when really the only thing that felt like a failure was that he couldn't let me carry it with him. She looked at her hands. I understand now why he did it, because I was doing the same thing, and I was wrong too. Harvey was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You were not wrong to be cautious. You were in a situation where every available choice had real costs. Caution was reasonable. It was also loneliness," she said. "Yes," he said, "it was that too." December came with cold mornings and clear days, and around the middle of the month, the first snow Dustcreek had seen in 3 years light. A dusting that turned the main street briefly beautiful and was gone by noon. Mabel stood in the doorway of the store and watched it fall and thought about the conversation they had the night before. Sitting by the stove after dinner at the small restaurant Mrs. Adele Crane ran next door, talking until considerably later than was strictly conventional, both of them reluctant to stop talking. She was in love with him. She had known it for some time, in the way you know something you have been refusing to name, and naming it was simple and enormous at once. He came to the store that same day, snow still faintly visible in the shadow of the eaves, and bought nothing, just came in and stood at the counter and looked at her. "Mabel," he said, "I have been trying to do this right. I have been trying not to rush you or pressure you. I believe I have been reasonably successful at that." "You have," she said. "I want to ask you something," he said. "Not to propose, not this second. I want to ask if you have arrived yet at a sense of where you are with me. Because I know where I am, and I have known for some time, and I am being patient, but I am not infinitely patient, and I would like to know if I am heading somewhere or standing still." She came around from behind the counter. She stood in front of him, closer than the counter had permitted, and looked up at him. "You are heading somewhere," she said. "You have been heading somewhere for a while now. I am sorry it took me so long to say it out loud." He looked at her carefully, as though checking the declaration for ambiguity. Finding none, he exhaled slowly, and then he smiled, a full one, the kind that reached his eyes and changed his whole face, and she had never seen him smile quite like that before, and it was better than she had imagined, and she had imagined it more than she was going to admit to him for some time yet. "Good," he said. She reached up and touched the scar on his jaw very lightly with her fingertips. "How did you get this?" "Barbed wire," he said. 1878. "We were setting fence in a hurry and I was not careful." "A practical scar," she said. "Most of mine are." She took her hand back. "I am going to want you to ask me again," she said. "The 5th time, when you think it's right. And I am going to want to say yes." He looked at her with the careful, steady attention that was entirely his. "I can do that," he said. She nodded. "Good." He bought a bag of coffee he didn't need and left in a better mood than she had ever seen him in, and Tommy Ruiz, who had witnessed the whole thing from his broom, made a sound of deep satisfaction and went back to sweeping with renewed purpose. Christmas of 1882 in Dustcreek was a modest, warm affair. The way Christmas in small frontier towns tends to be more candles than gifts, more songs than ceremony. More of the genuine warmth that comes from people who depend on each other for survival and have developed real feeling for one another as a result. The church was decorated with juniper branches and whatever could be improvised, and Reverend Hicks preached longer than was strictly necessary. And then the town gathered at the school hall for the communal dinner that had been a tradition in Dustcreek since before most of its current residents arrived. Harvey and Mabel sat together at the long table, which by now required no commentary from anyone, being simply understood. They helped serve food for the older residents and the families with many children. Mabel found, watching Harvey pass plates to the Patton family, including young Cal, who had grown several inches since the matter of the horse, that she was looking at the life she wanted with a clarity she had not previously been able to access. After dinner, after the carols and the departures and the slow dissolution of the gathering into the cold December night, Harvey walked her home again, and they stood on the step again. And this time when he said good night, he took her hand and held it for a moment and looked at her with everything he had kept composed for months showing plainly in his face. "Mabel," he said. "Not tonight," she said gently. "Ask me on a day when it is not Christmas and everyone expects it. Ask me on an ordinary day." He laughed, actually laughed, a low, real sound she had not heard from him often enough, and said, "All right, an ordinary day. Happy Christmas, Harvey. Happy Christmas, Mabel." January brought new cold and a town that had settled comfortably into its winter rhythms. The store was busier than usual because a hard freeze at the end of December had made travel difficult for 3 weeks. And when the thaw finally came in early January, people came in for everything they had run short of. Mabel worked long days and was tired in the good, productive way of being tired from useful work. Harvey spent January finishing the improvements to his property south of town. He had been working on it steadily since he arrived, a proper house from the original one-room structure he had bought, with 2 additional rooms and a real kitchen, and a covered porch that faced west to catch the evening light. He mentioned this to Mabel with a studied neutrality that was not entirely successful at concealing its purpose. She visited the property one Sunday in late January, at his invitation. She rode out in the mild winter sunshine and looked at what he had made of the place, and it was good, solid, and thoughtful, not pretentious but not bare either, with the covered porch and the kitchen he had mentioned and windows on 2 sides to take in the light. He had planted a kitchen garden plot that was dormant but clearly planned with care, and there was a well that ran good water and a barn with room for horses and cattle both. She stood on the porch and looked west at the hills, the sleeping animal hills that she had known all her life, and thought that you could see them very well from here. "You built this," she said. "Mostly," he said. "Nathan Reed's brother helped with the framing." "It's a home," she said. "That was the intention," he said. She turned around and looked at him standing in the doorway of his house and said, "Ask me now." He blinked. "This is Sunday." "It is an ordinary Sunday," she said. "Nothing about Sunday makes it not ordinary. Ask me now, Harvey." He came out onto the porch and stood in front of her and took her hands in his, and looked at her with all the patience and depth and steady, unshowy love of a man who had waited long enough and meant every word he was about to say. "Mabel Merriweather," he said, "I love you. I have been in love with you for some time, and I have had the sense not to say so until now because some things need their proper moment, and this is it, standing on this porch that I built with you in mind, on an ordinary Sunday in January, with the hills behind you and the sun on your face." He held her hands a little tighter. "Will you marry me?" She looked at him for a long moment, this man with his gray eyes and his practical scar and his 3 months of patient, honest, unglamorous courtship. This man who had come to Dustcreek to fight a wrong and stayed because of her, and built a porch that faced west to catch the evening light. "Yes," she said. "Yes, Harvey, I will." He pulled her to him and held her, and she pressed her face into the warmth of his neck and breathed, and the relief and joy of it were enormous and quiet at once, like the feeling after a long rain when the sky goes clean. They stood on the porch for a while in the January sun, not saying much, and then she pulled back and looked up at him and said, "I should tell you what took me so long." "You don't have to. I want to." She held his gaze. "I was afraid of loving someone when everything was so precarious. I was afraid that if I let myself love you and then lost the store, I would lose 2 things at once and I would not survive it. So I kept refusing you so that I could keep one certain thing while everything else was uncertain." She paused. "But what I didn't account for was that you were the thing making it less uncertain. That you were the stability I was refusing in order to manage my fear of instability." She shook her head slightly. "It sounds foolish when I say it aloud." "It doesn't," he said. "It sounds like a person who had been hurt and was protecting herself." It was also, she said quietly, that I wanted to be sure that the answer when I gave it was real, not gratitude, not relief, not convenience, real. And is it? He asked. She looked at him. Harvey. I fell in love with you sometime in September. I have been arguing with myself about it since then. It is entirely, absolutely real. He kissed her then, gently and thoroughly, on the porch of the house he had built, with the winter hills behind them and the clean January air, and the sound of his land in the quiet. They were married in March of 1883, on a day that began cold and warmed steadily through the morning, so that by the time Mabel walked into the small wooden church on the north end of Dustcreek's Main Street, it was a proper spring afternoon, the kind that makes the whole world look provisional and new. She wore a dress she had made herself from a bolt of ivory wool she had been keeping in the store for 2 years, without knowing quite why. She carried wildflowers that she and Esther Crane had found growing along the creek road that morning. She had done her own hair, dark and thick, pinned with her mother's tortoiseshell combs that she had kept carefully all these years. Tommy Ruiz, who had been given the great honor of walking her down the aisle in lieu of her father, did so with a seriousness and pride that made Mabel love him enormously. He had dressed in his best coat, which was old and clean, and he held her arm with a steadiness that told her he understood what he was doing. Harvey stood at the front of the church in a dark suit that he had bought from the tailor in Marfa on a trip he had taken specifically for that purpose, which Mabel had thought was wonderfully typical of him. He stood straight and still and watched her come down the aisle with the same quiet, focused attention he gave everything. And when she reached him and Tommy placed her hand in his, he held it with a steadiness that she had come to understand as the most reliable thing she had ever known. Reverend Hicks married them with a ceremony that was long by the standards of weddings and short by the standards of Aldous Hicks. And when Harvey kissed Mabel in front of the assembled population of Dustcreek, it was straightforward and unperformative, and the small crowd applauded with the warmth of people who had watched a story develop over 14 months and were deeply satisfied to see it arrive at its proper place. The reception was held in the school hall, as everything communal in Dustcreek was, and it featured Ben Castillo on his fiddle again, now having expanded to 4 songs, which felt like musical growth. They danced and ate and received the good wishes of their neighbors, and old Tommy Ruiz drank 2 small glasses of whiskey and told anyone who would listen that he had known from the very beginning that it would come to this, which was not entirely accurate but was forgivable. Mabel moved her personal belongings to Harvey's house south of town, but kept running the store, which was always going to be the arrangement, and which Harvey had never suggested should be otherwise. She rode in each morning and back each evening on a mare named Clover that Harvey had bought for her in February, good-tempered and sound, and the 4 miles of road between the store and home became a daily meditation that she found she loved. The store was hers, clear and free, and she ran it well. Within a year she had expanded the stock more dry goods, a small selection of books and newspapers, better coffee from a supplier in San Antonio that Harvey had found for her through a business contact. She extended credit to families who needed it without making them feel ashamed, as her father had done, and she kept meticulous accounts, and she was known for being fair and honest in the particular way that makes a business not just profitable but genuinely useful to its community. Harvey worked the land, expanded the small cattle operation he had started, and continued his involvement in the county's water rights discussions, which were becoming more important as the region developed. He was not a man who sought prominence but who got it anyway, because people found they could rely on what he said, and in that part of Texas in 1883 that was worth considerably more than money. In the evenings they sat on the porch and watched the hills go from gold to purple to dark, and talked about the things they were building, separately and together, and Mabel thought sometimes about the woman she had been a year and a half ago, sitting in the back of the store with the tin box and the dread and the carefully maintained wall, and she felt for that woman a deep and unsentimental compassion. She had been doing her best. She had been afraid. She had needed to arrive in her own time. The important thing was that she had arrived. In the late summer of 1883, Mabel discovered she was expecting a child. She told Harvey on a Sunday evening on the porch, watching the last light leave the hills, and his response was silence first, a silence full of such visible feeling that she did not try to fill it, just waited while he processed this enormous thing. Then he took her face in both hands and looked at her and said, in a voice that was quite different from his usual measured cadence, "Mabel, just that. Her name. But everything was in it." She laughed, the way she laughed when she forgot to be careful, and he kissed her, and the hills went dark around them. Their son was born in April of 1884, on a rainy Tuesday morning, delivered by Dr. Alton Pierce, who was Dustcreek's physician, and who had, by that point, brought about 60 children into the world and showed no signs of losing his steady manner or his competence. Mabel labored through the night and into the morning with the determined practicality that characterized everything she did. And when it was done and the child was placed in her arms, she felt the particular transformation of that moment, the one that has no adequate language. When you look at a person who did not exist yesterday and understand that they will be the most important thing you have ever done. He was a healthy boy with Harvey's gray eyes and Mabel's dark hair, and an immediate, vigorous opinion about everything, which he communicated in a volume that impressed the doctor and delighted his parents. They named him Gerald Harvey Mercer, for Mabel's father and for Harvey himself, and from the beginning they called him Jerry, and he grew up knowing his grandfather's name was in his own, which was the kind of memory that lives in a person without being asked to. Harvey held his son for the first time with the same steady attention he brought to all important things, and looked at him with an expression Mabel had not seen on his face before, and said quietly, "Hello," just that. As though introducing himself, as though it was important to begin correctly. "He has your eyes," Mabel said from the bed, tired and warm and more at peace than she could remember ever being. "He has your forehead," Harvey said, which made her laugh weakly. Tommy Ruiz came to see the baby that afternoon and declared him the finest child in the county, a sentiment he expressed about every child born in Dustcreek, but which in this case was delivered with particular conviction. Esther Crane brought soup. The town sent food for a week, and flowers and small gifts, and the general warm-spirited interest of a community in the new person who had arrived among them. The months that followed Jerry's birth were full in the way that a house with an infant is full, the particular demanding abundance of a new life, requiring everything and giving back everything in the form of the small, daily, world-altering discoveries of a person encountering existence for the first time. Mabel managed the store and the child simultaneously with a competence that the town observed and respected. Harvey managed the land and helped with Jerry in the evenings and on Sundays with a thoroughness that distinguished him, in the view of Dustcreek's women, from a number of other fathers in the area. They were tired. They were also, both of them, profoundly happy in the plain, grounded way that is not the happiness of early romance, but the happiness of a life that is genuinely, durably good. 2 years after Jerry's birth, in the spring of 1886, Mabel found herself expecting again. This time she was less surprised and more comfortable with the news, and Harvey received it with a smile that came more easily now, less complicated by the magnitude of the first time. Their second child was a girl, born in November of 1886, and they named her Clara June Mercer, for Mabel's mother. She was a quieter child than her brother, observant and precise, with Mabel's capacity for steady attention and Harvey's careful way of considering things before she spoke. From almost the beginning she had opinions about the store, appearing to find the organized rows of goods and the satisfying mathematics of inventory deeply compelling, which made Mabel both amused and proud. Jerry, by this time 2½, regarded his sister with the complex mixture of indignation and fascination, characteristic of a child who has previously been the only child. He arrived at affection by late February, when Clara demonstrated an early interest in following him with her eyes, which he correctly interpreted as admiration, and thenceforth considered her a reasonable addition to the household. The house on the land south of Dustcreek had grown with the family. Harvey had added 2 more rooms the previous year, and the kitchen garden that had been a plan when Mabel first saw the property was now a productive reality, vegetables in season. A small herb garden along the south wall that Mabel tended with a genuine pleasure she had not known she would find in it. Apple trees that were still small but were growing. A mulberry tree near the well that gave shade in summer, and berries that Clara would, in a few years, eat directly from the branches with an efficiency that made Mabel think of herself as a child. The store continued to thrive. The railroad spur that Fitch had been positioning himself for did arrive, in 1887, running not quite through Dustcreek but close enough 4 miles north, with a station at a new settlement that grew up around it, which everyone called New Station, with a lack of imagination that became its actual name. The spur changed the economics of the region. Goods became easier to get. Prices dropped on some things. The character of the population shifted as new people came in, drawn by the connectivity. Mabel adapted the store accordingly, improving her supply lines, diversifying stock, hiring a young woman named Pearl Holloway to help with the counter during busy hours, which had become considerable. Harvey's cattle operation expanded alongside the region's growth. He was not the biggest rancher in the county, but he was one of the most reliable, and his water rights work, which had put him into contact with county officials and eventually state ones, had given him a network and a credibility that translated into other kinds of opportunity. He was offered a seat on the county commission in 1888 and declined it, saying he was not a politician, but agreed the following year to serve on the water board, which was the thing he actually cared about. He continued, through all of this, to have breakfast with his family every morning and dinner with them every evening unless circumstances genuinely prevented it. He read to Jerry and Clara from the books that Mabel kept in the store, an expanding collection that was by now a point of some local distinction: novels and history and adventure stories. And for the children, the illustrated books that began arriving from Eastern publishers with more regularity as the railroad opened up the supply lines. Jerry loved the adventure stories with a passion that alarmed him not at all, and entertained his parents considerably. Clara preferred the nature books, the ones with careful illustrations of birds and plants, and she was known to correct her father on the identification of hawks in flight, which she had learned from the book and he had not. The autumn of 1888 brought a development that no one in Dustcreek had anticipated, and which forced Mabel and Harvey to revisit a chapter of their history they had considered fully closed. Cornelius Fitch, who had left the county in late 1882 and had not been seen since, was tried in San Antonio for fraud, in a case built in part on the material Harvey had sent to Judge Harlan Greer 6 years earlier. The trial was covered in the San Antonio Express, and a copy reached Dustcreek through the mail, and Mabel read the account of it at the store counter with a feeling that was more complicated than she had expected. Fitch was convicted of 2 counts of fraud. He was sentenced to 4 years in the state penitentiary. The judge, in his statement, noted that the case had been materially advanced by documentation provided by a private citizen in Dustcreek several years prior, and thanked that citizen for their thoroughness. Harvey read the account when he came in that evening. He put the newspaper down and was quiet for a moment. "Is it enough?" Mabel asked. "For the families he ruined in New Mexico?" "No," he said. "For your father, maybe not entirely." He paused. "But it's something." "It is," she said. "It is the right thing, having happened eventually, even if eventually took a long time." "It usually does," he said. She reached across the kitchen table and took his hand, and he turned it to hold hers properly, the way he had done since before they were married, and they sat with that for a moment. "My father would have liked you," she said. "I hope so," Harvey said. I would have liked him too, I think. He raised you, and you are the best argument for him anyone could make." This was not the sort of thing Harvey said often. When he said it, the rarity made it enormous. Mabel pressed his hand and didn't try to respond in words, because some things are better held than spoken. In the years that followed, Dustcreek grew and changed in the way that West Texas towns grow and change at the end of the 19th century. More people, more buildings, the school expanding. A second church established by a Methodist congregation that arrived from the East and was received by Reverend Hicks with a civility that cost him considerable effort. The railroad spur at New Station brought commerce and a new generation of settlers, people from different places with different customs and experiences, and Mabel's store became, in a way she had not planned but came to appreciate, something of a meeting point. The place where everyone came because everyone needed supplies, and where the conversations that happen between people who need to understand each other in order to live together took place over the counter. Over the weighing of flour and the selection of thread and the ordering of goods from the broadening catalogs that arrived each season. She was not naive about the injustices of the world her store sat in. The Apache bands who had once moved freely through this land had been confined to reservations in the years before she was born, and the Mexican families who had farmed this region for generations before Anglo settlement were often treated as lesser by their neighbors in ways that Mabel found both obvious and wrong. She extended credit without distinction of origin. She spoke to every customer with the same careful respect. She refused once to serve a man who had spoken with contempt about a Mexican family that was in the store at the same time, told him to come back when he had better manners, and did not particularly care about the gossip it generated. Harvey had said when she told him, "Good," and meant it. Jerry Mercer grew up tall, with his father's measured way and his mother's quickness, and developed a passion for engineering that expressed itself first in elaborate constructions of sticks and stones and later in a genuine mathematical aptitude that the schoolteacher in Dustcreek, a sharp woman named Miss Florence Garrett, identified and encouraged. He had his mother's laughter and his father's patience, and a directness that was entirely his own, and he was known in the town as a boy who kept his word, which was the thing his parents were most proud of. Clara grew into her observant precision and expanded it in a dozen directions. The nature books, yes, but also her mother's accounting, the satisfying logic of keeping the store's records straight, the medicinal herbs that Dr. Pierce occasionally consulted her about because she had absorbed more from the relevant books than he had had time to, and a talent for drawing that she expressed in small, careful sketches of the land and the people and the creatures she observed with such concentrated attention. On a Sunday evening in October of 1890, Mabel sat on the porch with Harvey as she had done 1,000 times by then, watching the hills go from gold to purple to dark, and Jerry was inside with a book and Clara was at the table with her drawing, and the sound of the land and the light on the hills were exactly as they always were, constant and extraordinary. "What are you thinking?" Harvey said. "I'm thinking about the ring on the floor," she said. He was quiet for a moment. 6 years ago. Almost exactly, October. She turned to look at him. "I was so angry at you that day." "You were right to be," he said. "I had handled the first 3 very badly." "You had handled them with more grace than most people would have," she said. "But I needed you to ask differently, not with a ring and a counter between us, but honestly, what you actually knew, what you actually wanted." She paused. "When you told me about the debt, I was terrified, but I was also, I think I was waiting for it, waiting for you to be real with me instead of correct. I was trying not to overwhelm you," he said. "I know. And then you did overwhelm me, and it turned out to be exactly what was needed." He reached over and took her hand the way he still did, the way she still liked, the solid warmth of it. "You said yes," he said. "I said yes," she agreed. "Eventually." "The 4th time." "The 5th time, really. The 4th time was different." "The 4th time was different," he agreed. She leaned into him slightly and they watched the last light leave the hills, and the stars came out above them in their millions, cold and indifferent and spectacular, the same stars that had been above Dustcreek when she had been alone and afraid and holding a tin box with $47 and a debt she could not pay. She thought about her father and what he had hoped for her. She thought about her mother, whose comb she still wore on significant days. She thought about the store, free and clear, with its expanding stock and its good accounts, and the smell of coffee and wool and lamp oil that had meant safety and work and purpose to her since she was a child. She thought about this house and this porch and the kitchen garden along the south wall and the apple trees still growing. She thought about Harvey, who had come to Dustcreek to fight a wrong and stayed because of her, and built a porch that faced west, and had held her with 4 refused proposals and his own good sense, and the patience of a man who understood that some things needed their proper moment and could wait for it without being diminished by the waiting. "Harvey," she said. "Yes, I love you." It was not the first time she had said it, not by considerable distance, but she said it every time with the same directness, and meant it every time in the same real, specific, unambiguous way. "I love you too," he said simply, the way he said things that were true without ornamentation. They sat on the porch until the dark was full and the stars were complete above them, and the sounds of the children in the house had quieted. And then they went inside to the warmth of the kitchen, where Clara was still drawing and Jerry had fallen asleep over his book with the peaceful authority of a 12-year-old who has had a full day. Harvey picked Jerry up without waking him, which he could still just barely do, and carried him to his room. Mabel looked at Clara's drawing. It was the view from the porch, the hills in the last light, rendered with that careful, characteristic precision, and said, "That's very good." Clara considered it. "The far hill isn't right yet," she said. "Give it time," Mabel said, kissing her on the head. "It'll come." She banked the kitchen fire for the night and checked the door and moved through the quiet rooms of the house. And outside the stars were still above Dustcreek, the same stars that had been there in the hard years and the good ones, above the general store with its clear deed, and the land to the south with its covered porch and its kitchen garden. Above the church and the school and the road between them that Mabel rode every morning and every evening, with the particular contentment of a person who is exactly where they mean to be. Harvey came out of Jerry's room and found her in the hallway and put his arm around her, and they stood for a moment in the quiet house, listening to the small sounds of their children sleeping, and Mabel thought, as she often did when things were very good, about the specificity of what had been required to get here. Not just the courage and the love, though those were essential, but the exact sequence of it. The 4 refusals and the 5th question, and the ring on the floor and the words about the debt, and the afternoon on a porch in January when she had finally said yes with her whole self, without a wall between her and the truth of what she felt. Every single piece of it had been necessary. Every difficult moment, every refused proposal, every night of not sleeping with the tin box under the counter. Because if any of it had been different, she might have arrived somewhere that looked like here but was not. This was not Harvey in the hallway, and the children sleeping and the stars above Dustcreek, and the particular, specific, irreplaceable life she had built in the place where she was rooted and meant to be. She turned her face into Harvey's shoulder and breathed. "Time for sleep," he said. "Yes," she said, and that was enough. It was, in fact, everything. The years continued to unspool in the good way, the way years do when the foundation is sound and the people building on it are paying attention. Mabel turned 40 in 1896, and Harvey made her a dinner from every recipe she had mentioned over the years that she had never gotten around to making herself, which required him to begin preparations 4 days in advance and consult Pearl Holloway twice, and burned 2 things, and resulted in a table that was, by any reasonable standard, extraordinary, and which Jerry and Clara ate with the combination of pride and amusement that children bring to seeing their parents be extravagant with each other. Jerry left for engineering school in Austin in 1897, 18 years old and ready for the wider world in the direct, confident way of a person who has been well prepared for it without being sheltered from its real demands. Mabel stood on the platform at New Station and watched the train take him and did not cry until Harvey put his arm around her. And then she cried in the efficient way she did everything, quickly and completely, and was done. "He'll be fine," Harvey said. "I know," she said. "That's almost why it's hard." Clara stayed in Dustcreek, which no one who knew her was surprised by. She was the store's future as surely as she was the Hill's best illustrator, and she had known it her own way, with the observant precision that had been her characteristic since infancy. She began working the counter formally at 16 and took over the accounts fully at 18, and Mabel found herself transitioning into an advisory role with a piece that told her the store was where it was always going to be, in good hands, hands that had grown up behind that counter and knew every shelf and ledger and long-time customer by name. In the spring of 1898, a young man named Thomas Whitfield came to Dustcreek from San Antonio, a surveyor's assistant with a quiet manner and an obvious intelligence, and it became apparent within the first month, a particular interest in the young woman who ran the general store. Clara studied him with her characteristic methodical attention, concluded her assessment over the course of several months, and began a courtship that proceeded with a deliberateness that made Mabel, watching it, recognize something profoundly familiar. She said to Harvey one evening, "She is doing what I did." Harvey said, "She is being careful. It is not a bad quality." "No," Mabel agreed. "It isn't." Thomas Whitfield was patient, and patient was what was needed. By December, he and Clara had arrived at an understanding, and by the following spring, they were married in the same small wooden church where Mabel and Harvey had stood 16 years earlier, with the sun coming through the windows in the same spring light. Mabel walked Clara down the aisle because Clara had asked her to, and this was the moment when the combs in Mabel's hair, her mother's tortoiseshell combs, meant everything they had ever meant. 3 generations of women doing the best they could with what they had and finding it, ultimately, sufficient. Jerry came back from Austin for the wedding with an engineering degree and a great deal of enthusiasm about irrigation systems, and a composed young woman named Helen Burke, whom he introduced to his parents with a directness that strongly suggested things were serious. He was correct. They were married the following autumn, in Austin, and Mabel and Harvey made the trip by train, which they had not done before, and found both the city and the marriage ceremony entirely satisfactory. Harvey Mercer sat next to his wife on the train home and watched the Texas landscape go by in the early dusk and said, "I didn't know we would end up with all of this." "All of what?" Mabel said. He gestured in a way that encompassed the train and the journey and the implied entirety of what they were returning to. "This much, this good a thing." She took his hand. "Did you doubt it?" He thought about it honestly, the way he thought about everything. "In October of 1882, standing in your store with the ring I had just dropped on the floor, yes, I doubted it considerably." She laughed. "You didn't look like you doubted it." "I was very composed," he agreed. "And then you told me about the debt." "And then I told you about the debt. And everything changed," she said. "Yes," he said, "everything changed." She leaned her head against his shoulder and watched the Texas dusk outside the train window and thought about how a life is made, not in single enormous moments, but in the accumulation of smaller ones, each true, each chosen, each building on the one before. The flour and the salt and the length of rope on the first visit, the coffee on the third, the 4 proposals and their 4 refusals, and the 5th question asked on an ordinary Sunday in January on a porch built for 2 people. The tin box with $47 in it, and the debt that was never, ultimately, hers to carry alone. The ring on the floor of the store and the silence that had followed, and then the voice that had said something real. Outside the train window, the stars were coming up over West Texas as they always did, indifferent and spectacular, the same stars that had been above Dustcreek the whole time, above the hard years and the good ones, Above the store and the house and the porch and the kitchen garden and the apple trees that were full-grown now, heavy and productive, exactly as they had been designed to become. The train moved through the dark toward home. They arrived in Dustcreek on a Wednesday morning, coming in on the local line from the new station spur, and the familiar Main Street with its familiar buildings met them with the unceremonious welcome of a place that knows you well enough not to make an event of your return. Pearl Holloway had kept the store running in Mabel's absence and reported that nothing of consequence had occurred, except that old Tommy Ruiz had come in every day to check on things, which he did not need to do since he had retired 2 years ago from his sweeping, but which no one was going to suggest he stop. Tommy came by that afternoon to hear about Austin and to look at Mabel with the satisfied expression of a man for whom the world has proceeded as it should. He was 73 years old now, still sharp, still direct. "The boy is settled?" he asked. "He is very settled," Mabel said. "Helen is good for him. She doesn't let him make things more complicated than they need to be." "That's what you want," Tommy said, with the authority of long observation. "Someone to make the right things simple." He accepted a piece of the coffee cake Mabel had brought from a bakery in Austin. "That's what Mr. Mercer did for you, eventually." "He did," Mabel agreed. "And you made the right things simple for him too," Tommy said. "That is the best kind of marriage, when both sides do that for each other." He finished his coffee cake, looked around the store with proprietary satisfaction, and went home. Mabel stood in the quiet of the store, in the smell of coffee and wool and lamp oil that was the smell of her whole life, and felt the truth of what he had said settle in her, with the clarity of things that have been true for a long time and need only to be named to be seen fully. Harvey came in at 4 o'clock, as he often did when he had been out on the land and was heading back toward the house, and bought a bag of coffee he didn't need, as he often did, which she had long since stopped questioning because the ritual of it was its own thing, its own small daily confirmation. "Ready to go home," he said. "Almost," she said. "Give me 5 minutes." She finished what she was doing. She counted the day's receipts, noted them in the ledger in Clara's neat hand, which was now the hand the ledger lived in. She straightened the counter, checked the lamp oil in the lamp she kept there, and looked around at the store her father had built and she had kept and Clara would carry forward. Then she took off her apron, hung it on its hook, and went out from behind the counter to where her husband was waiting by the door with the late afternoon light coming through the window and the bag of coffee in his hand and 22 years of ordinary days in his face, and she took his arm, and they went home. The covered porch faced west, as it always had, and the hills were there, the sleeping animal hills going from gold to purple in the October evening, the same hills that had been there the whole time, patient and permanent, witness to all of it. They sat down. They watched the light change. The stars came out above Dustcreek, cold and brilliant and eternally, indifferently spectacular, and below them the town went about its life, and the store sat on the main street with its clear deed and its good accounts and its shelves full of the things that people need to live. And in the house behind the porch 2 people sat in the specific, irreplaceable silence of a life that has been built with care and love and honesty and patience over a long time, and is very, very good.